What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Welcome to part 3 of this series, Fundamental Theorems. The topic of today's video is bluffing. This is what we can expect in this episode. Definition of bluffing. So what is bluffing? What are any associated mathematical formulas we need to be aware of? We're going to discuss some of the misconceptions regarding bluffing that many players have. We're going to talk a little bit about bluff sizing. We're going to have a look at some hand history examples, and then we will summarize everything. Let's start with the absolute basics. So what is a bluff? Now hopefully there aren't too many of us here who don't know what a bluff is. A bluff is a bet specifically designed to get better hands to fold, and our required success frequency is a function of our bet sizing. So what exactly does the second part mean? Probably the first sentence there makes inherent sense. We probably don't have the best hand. We want to get better hands that our opponent might have to fold. The second part, required success frequency, is a function of our bet sizing. What that essentially means when translated is the larger our bluff sizing, the more often it needs to work to be profitable. A common misconception that new players might have, and most of us probably don't have this misconception, is that a bluff needs to work over 50% of the time to be profitable. Now that's absolutely not the case. It's really just a function of our bet sizing. Imagine, for example, that there is $1 million pot, and you have the option to bluff $50 into that pot, but you know your bluff would only work 10% of the time. Now the question is, would you make that bluff? Well, the truth is that that bluff is going to fail the majority of the time. It's actually going to fail 90% of the time. It's only going to work 10%. But because we're only risking $50 and we could potentially win $1 million 10% of the time when our bluff works, it should hopefully be obvious that our bluff does not need to work over 50% of the time. The frequency with which we require our bluffs to work in order to generate profit is based on how much we're investing relative to the size of the current pot. And in fact, the relationship is exactly that. It's what percentage of the current pot are we investing. So let's have a look at a quick example. Imagine there's $100 in the middle, and we decide to bluff at that $100 for half pot. So the question is, how often does that bluff need to work in order to be instantly profitable, disregarding any pot equity we have? We simply look at what percentage of the total pot we're investing. So if there's 100 in the middle, and we're going to be investing 50, so keep in mind that the total pot size will now be 150. And we're investing of that 150, we're investing 50. So what percentage of 150 is 50? Well, we can do that very simply by doing 50 divided by 150. We get what is known as a percentage in decimal format. What that essentially means is just look at the information to the right of the point. Don't worry about anything else. Alternatively, if you need to, you can just times it by 100. So we get the result there, 33. That stands for 33%. What that essentially means is if we make a half pot bet and we ignore any of the pot equity we have, in other words, let's imagine we just have 2 blank cards. They have no shot at winning if they get called. Let's say they're drawing dead if they get called. If our half pot bluff succeeds more than 33% of the time, we're still making money. Even if every single time we get called we have to check fold in a later street, we're instantly profitable because our opponent is folding too much. In fact, we can refer to an opponent folding exactly 33% as the break-even point on our bluff. In other words, let's say we bluff a half pot and our opponent defends exactly 67% of the time or so. In other words, our bluff works exactly 33.33 of the time. It means we don't make any money and we don't lose any money. It means our expectation relative to the current decision is going to be exactly 0. So we can refer to that as a break-even point. It also means that if our opponent's folding less than 33% of the time, it means we actually lose money with our bluff. We'd be better off check folding, which is going to be 0 EV relative to the current decision. And if our opponent folds more than 33, then it's actually better to bluff than it is to check fold. So we can refer to 33% as the break-even point of our bluff. Now, it's a very good idea to spend some time. You could even make an Excel sheet or a spreadsheet, something like this, with common bet sizings and how frequently they need to work. So you can see, for example, that a half pot bet needs to work 33% of the time. But let's say we bet 75% of the pot. How often does that need to work? Well, we can just do 75 divided by 175. We can see that a 3/4 pot size bet needs to work 42% of the time. This can be very, very useful in terms of improving your efficiency with a HUD as well, for example. Let's say, for example, we wanted to establish how often someone needs to fold to our 3-bet in order for it to be instantly profitable, or automatic profit as it's referred to frequently in the poker community. Well, let's think about a common scenario. Let's imagine the button open raises to 3 big blinds. We're in the big blind and we decide to 3-bet to 10 big blinds. How often does that need to work in order to break even? Well, what's our investment? You have to be a little bit careful here, because although we raised to 10 big blinds, our investment is actually 9 big blinds because the big blind's already there. And what's the total size of the pot? Well, it's our 10 big blinds plus the button's 3 big blinds plus the small blind's 0.5 big blinds. So we're actually investing 9 big blinds into a total pot of 13.5. Therefore, the break-even point on our bluff is 66.66%. So if you have a decent sample size of stats on someone, and you see that they're folding 69% of the time to 3-bets, then that's probably a good target to 3-bet hyper aggressively, because we get to generate automatic profit. And the other thing as well is, although we consider a zero equity scenario where we have 2 blank cards for simplicity's sake, in most cases when we bluff, and this is especially true for pre-flop, flop, and turn decisions, we're not going to be bluffing with zero equity, in fact. It's actually going to be a mistake to bluff with zero equity unless we have a read that our opponent is drastically overfolding in a certain scenario. Most of our pre-flop, flop, and turn bluffs, our hands should have some potential to win by the river. They should still have some equity. So in truth, if we were to make a 75% pot size bet, for example, in most cases it won't need to work even 42% of the time, because we're going to be making our bluffs with equity. The exception, of course, is on the river, where we either have 100% equity with our holding or we have 0% equity, aside from the rare case that we chop. The earlier streets, we're usually still going to have live equity when we bluff. And we can refer to these as semi-bluffs, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to assume that we have 0 equity, because we're just thinking about bluffing on its own first of all, before we merge it with other concepts such as our equity. Now let's just have a look at that depicted in our EV calculation software, CardRunner's EV. So firstly, let me just describe a little bit about the scenario that we're looking at right now. So we've given big blind 7-6. In other words, he has 7-6 high. We can see the board run out 9-5-2, 4 deuce. So 7-6 high is literally 7 high. And incidentally, it doesn't beat any of the hands in button's range. So if button folds, we're going to win. If button calls, we're pretty much always going to lose. In other words, we have a pure bluff, as we very well frequently on the river anyway. Now the pot size is going to be 50 big blinds on the river. And we're going to be betting half pot. Now we've already looked at a half pot bet. We know it needs to work about 33% of the time. So what we've done here is we've designed a scenario where we bet half pot and our opponent decides to call exactly 67% of the time. In other words, he's calling at more or less the break-even frequency in terms of whether our bluff makes profit or not, and he's going to be folding exactly 33% of the time. So let's run the EV on this scenario and see what the result is. Well, we can see in this case that the EV is 0. That's exactly what we expect. This is going to be a break-even bluff. And actually you can see that he's calling 66.7, so even a bit more precise than just 66. He's folding 33.3. The EV is 0. This is going to be a break-even bluff. Now let's just modify that situation slightly. Let's have a look at a situation where we make a slightly profitable bluff. So everything about this example is going to be exactly the same. Still betting half pot, 25 big blinds into a pot of 50. But the difference is our opponent is actually going to be slightly folding more than 33%. In fact, we've done the EV run calculation and we can see that our opponent is folding 37.5% of the time now, and he's calling 62.5% of the time. So he's actually folding above the frequency where we'd expect to generate profit with our bluff. So let's have a look at our EV. Well, our EV is 3.13. So we can see that this is now a slightly profitable bluff. Our opponent's folding more than that 33.33% break-even threshold. Let's look at the scenario where our opponent doesn't fold. Let's say he folds a little bit less. Let's do the EV run on this calculation. Now, once again, everything's the same, but we've given our opponent the ability to call 80% of the time when facing a half-pot river bet. In fact, exactly 79.2, as we can see. So that means we're bluffing. We need it to work 33.33% of the time in order to break even, but is only working 20.8% of the time. We should expect to lose money in this scenario. Let's have a look at our expectation. It's minus 9.38. So by bluffing, we're actually losing an extra 9.38 big blinds because our opponent is simply not folding enough. It's actually a higher EV for us to check fold because we know that check folding is 0 EV. Now the other thing to keep in mind, if we go back to our original example here, exactly break-even bluff. Well, if we make an exactly break-even bluff, there's no difference between doing that and check folding. Because we can see here that our EV is 0. If we were to instead modify this tree, so let's say for example we decide to check, our opponent decides to bet, doesn't really matter how much he bets really because we're just going to be check folding every time. Let's have a look at our EV. Well, surprise surprise, our EV there is 0. So there's no real difference between making a break-even bluff and check folding. The expectation is going to be exactly 0 both times. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward so far, so let's now think about some of the common misconceptions players have regarding bluffing. So the first one is that a profitable bluff does not guarantee max EV. So I've seen situations where players have spent a long time on the river counting how many combinations their opponent will fold to see if he folds above the break-even threshold for making profit. And let's say, for example, that player does end up folding. Let's say we need him to fold 33. We count the combinations of hands he has. We find out that he's folding 38%. The assumption then is that bluffing is going to be the best play. Well, that's the wrong assumption to draw. The assumption we should be drawing is that bluffing will be plus EV. It doesn't guarantee that bluffing will be max EV. This is one of the issues with bluffs. Sometimes players get a little bit trigger happy as soon as they see that a bluff is working above the break-even threshold. One common example of this can be found when we consider the topic of delayed c-bets. Let's say, for example, we open raise pre-flop. We find that our opponent is folding 41% of the time to flop c-bets. And let's just say we have, once again, 2 garbage cards that can't improve. If we c-bet, let's say for around 2/3 pot, and 2/3 pot bet needs to work about 40%. Our bluff is actually working 41%. What that means is we're generating a very, very small amount of profit. It is plus EV, but that doesn't guarantee it's max EV. We have to compare it to our other options. We might find, for example, that if we were to not c-bet, fold to a turn lead from our opponent if he's out of position, but when he checks, we go for a delayed c-bet, we might find the overall expectation of that line is higher than the expectation we generate when we just fire a continuation bet, taking a very marginal amount of automatic profit. So this is one thing that we have to keep in mind. Now the way it applies to river situations, especially in situations where we have some kind of showdown value, we may find that we can generate automatic profit with a river bluff, but that doesn't guarantee we're generating the max EV. So a common mistake someone might make is, let's say they get to the river with bottom pair, for example, and they figure out that their opponent is folding just above the break-even threshold. As soon as they find out that information, they're very, very trigger happy. They want to bluff now because they can see it's plus EV. But what they haven't done is they haven't calculated the expectation of a check and compared that to the expectation of bluffing. Now let's have a look at an example of this. So very, very similar setup right now. We're still out of position on the river. We're betting half pot as usual. We've changed our holding. The same board right now, but we actually have ace-4 right now, which means we have a pair. Very, very marginal showdown value. Now we bet, let's just say our opponent is going to be folding about 40% of the time. Let's just do the EV run, because he is folding 40.5% of the time. And we're betting half pot, so one thing that we know immediately is this is going to be profitable because he's folding above the break-even threshold. Now, in order to fully come to grips with this example, we're going to have a quick look at our opponent's range to really conceptualize this. So what have we given him here? Well, we've given him a bunch of busted club combos. Okay, so these are things like busted ace queen, busted ace jack, busted king 10 of clubs, for example. Then we've given him 9x. So this is not designed to be a realistic range, although it's not completely unrealistic. It's designed to be a range that we can easily understand and conceptualize. His range is split between combos of busted club draws, which we incidentally beat because we have a pair, and then hands with a 9x, where he's actually having the best hand. He's not going to fold against our bet in most cases. So we bluff against this range, and it's going to be working at 40.5% of the time. But let's just have a look at the types of hands that our opponent's folding in this case. So we can see that almost in its entirety, his folding range is actually busted clubs. Well, guess what? We already beat busted clubs. We don't necessarily need to bluff to fold out those holdings. Like if we had 6-7, we definitely fire. And that's because we know that checking with 6-7, 7 high, the first example we looked at, has pretty much zero showdown value. In other words, checking is going to be 0 EV. So if we can generate 5.38 big blinds in expectation with a bluff, we should obviously bluff. But now we're in a scenario where we have some showdown value, and checking is not necessarily going to be 0 EV anymore. Let's imagine our opponent is really passive and is going to check back a bunch. We get to fully realize our equity against his busted clubs. But the other thing is, right now, when our opponent does have a 9x for the most part, well, he's actually calling. So we're going to lose an additional 25 big blinds every time our opponent has a 9x. So we're not actually folding out that many better hands with this bluff. We're folding out the occasional 9x, but we're mostly folding out hands that we beat anyway. So alarm bells should be ringing right now. We can't just assume that because this is plus EV that it's what we should be doing. In fact, it's very likely we should be checking, or at the very least we need to have a look at the expectation of checking. So let's load up the same situation. But now we're going to have a look at our expectation when we check instead of bluff. So let's have a look at the scenario. We still have ace 4. We decide to check. Our opponent checks back all of his hands. So we should still have the same range. So in other words, he's not value betting a 9x and he's not bluffing. Okay, very passive opponent. And of course, you are going to find guys who will bluff here and they will value bet a 9x. So poker is a lot more nuanced than a passive player who just always lets us fully realize our equity in the scenario. But we want to have a starting point. And this is the simplest possible starting point. Our opponent doesn't bet any 9x hands and he never bluffs. Let's have a look at our expectation now. We can see here that our expectation is jumped up to 18 big blinds. In other words, it's actually a lot better for us to just check here than bluff. So it's very easy for us to look at this scenario and see that we're making money if we decide to turn our pair into bluffer in the river and say, wow, we're making 5 big blinds when we do this. But we're not generating the max EV. So bluffing is actually going to be a mistake here. So it's important to understand that just because we make money with certain plays doesn't mean that we're not making a mistake. It often just means that we found ourselves in a profitable situation by no ability of our own. It's just simply the way the cards fell. But our goal is to maximize our expectation in every single decision node. So we should never look at this spot and say, well, I bluffed ace 4 here and I made money, so it's a good play. No, it's not a good play because we didn't maximize our expectation. You can see here that checking, assuming the variables that we have provided here, such as our opponent always checks back, we'll see that checking is actually a better play in this case. We're generating 18 big blinds as opposed to around about 5 big blinds as we saw previously. Now, something you might be wondering about, just a little bit on that topic of, well, what if the guy does bet with some frequency? Well, actually, assuming that we're going to check fold when he bets, it doesn't actually change our expectation. And we're kind of assuming that he's going to be betting his top pair hands for value, and he doesn't bluff very much. Okay, it might change our expectation if we check fold and he bluffs with a high frequency. But in this scenario, let's say he doesn't bluff, but he does bet all of his 9x hands, and we decide to just check fold, and we calculate our expectation here, you can see that our expectation is exactly the same. So just to be clear here, we're checking with the intention of check folding. Let's say he just checks back 36% of the time, and that's going to be his busted club draws, and then he bets top pair in position 33% of the time. But given that we check fold, And given that our expectation against these hands was 0 anyway, because we're going to lose at showdown, you see the overall expectation is not affected here. So some of the extra game tree details are irrelevant. We're really interested on if he starts bluffing hyper-aggressively, then maybe we have to check call, for example. But in this case, you can see that it doesn't change our expectation, even if he does bet with some frequency, and we have to check fold, assuming that he bets those top pair type hands rather than his busted clubs. So let's move on to our second misconception. Hopefully, if you've seen the video on value betting, part 2 of this series, you'll already have a pretty good understanding of this concept. A break-even bluff does not break even. If you are making a break-even bluff, it means you are losing money. You're breaking even only with respect to the current decision node, but you're actually losing money for the overall hand. So let's just go back to our first example. We saw that our expectation was 0 with our break-even bluff. So he's folding exactly at the break-even threshold here. And we saw that our expectation was 0. So we're breaking even. But we're only breaking even with respect to the river play. Because keep in mind that there's 50 big blinds in this pot, and we very likely contributed 25 big blinds to that pot. So essentially, if we're making nothing on the river, and the overall outcome for the hand is nothing, yet we've invested 25 big blinds in earlier streets, then the expectation for the overall hand is actually minus 25 big blinds. Now that's not necessarily our fault. It usually just means that we didn't hit a very good run out for our hand. And it may be that 0 big blinds is the highest expectation we can generate relative to the current decision node. We should be happy with that, if it's the most we can generate. The fact that we lose money for the overall hand is more of a function that maybe our opponent hit the flop harder than us rather than anything to do with our skill. We're going to lose or have a negative expectation for the overall hand very, very frequently in this game, and there's nothing we can do about it. It just often means that our opponent maybe hit top set. Of course our expectation is going to be negative. Our goal is to maximize our expectation relative to the current node. So if, for example, our opponent has a set, and continuing is going to be minus EV because we have garbage, then the highest expectation we can generate relative to the current node is going to be 0. We should be happy with that. We're not in control over the fact that our opponent flopped top set. It just means he got lucky, and that's why we're losing money overall. So just to see this illustrated, what we have here is a very, very simple game tree, where there's 0 big blinds in the pot on the turn, which is of course impossible. And big blind decides to bet 25 big blinds into a dry pot, and button decides to call. So there's 50 big blinds in the middle, but both players have invested 25 out of that 50 pot. Now on the river, big blind decides to check fold, and remember that this is pretty much the same expectation as making a break-even bluff. You can see that big blind's expectation on the river is 0. He doesn't make any money. But is his expectation for the overall hand 0? Well, if we go back to the first decision node, we can see that big blind's expectation is actually minus 25. That's his expectation for the overall hand. He's actually losing money. Because if he invests 25 big blinds and then makes a break-even check fold on the river, he's not really breaking even. He's down 25 big blinds for the overall hand. Final thing is, we mentioned how we can use the break-even point of bluffs to effectively use HUD stats. For example, maybe a guy's folding 50% to flop C bets, and we're making a 2/3 pot size bet, so we only need him to fold 40%. He's technically folding too much. He's allowing us to generate automatic profit. The misconception is that this is a huge mistake, when it might be a mistake, but it also might not be. It's not always a mistake to fold at a frequency which allows our opponent to generate automatic profit. There's a number of reasons why we actually might want to overfold. For example, let's just take a very simple half-pot C-bet on the flop. We know it needs to work 33% of the time. But let's say our opponent is out of position. It might be correct now for him to actually fold above 33% of the time. He has to keep in mind that he has a huge positional disadvantage in the hand. He's probably not going to be able to make defending a very wide range profitable. The reverse situation could happen. Let's say we're c-betting out of position. Now maybe our opponent should fold less than 33% because he has a huge positional advantage. Other things include range versus range advantage. Let's say one player's range just simply has much more equity than his opponent's. it makes sense that the player with the weaker range is probably going to be folding at a frequency which allows the player with a strong range to generate automatic profit, so to speak. This is not necessarily a mistake, it can actually be tactically the best thing to do. Even in an exploitative sense, if you know that a guy, for example, just doesn't c-bet very much, let's say he only c-bets top set, for example, well, of course it's going to be a mistake now to try and defend very aggressively against that. You should be folding 95% of the time. You should only be continuing with very good draws, for example. So it's not a mistake to overfold in that scenario, it's actually a very good exploitative decision. Our opponent only bets top set, so we barely defend against that. We're the one that's exploiting him now, because he doesn't get his top set paid off. A common application to this in low-limit games is when facing 3-bets from your opponent. Your opponents probably don't 3-bet as much as they should be, so it's not necessarily a mistake if we end up folding very, very close to that break-even threshold. In fact, it's not even a big deal to fold 70% of the time to 3-bet if you're playing low-limit games. That's because your opponents just aren't 3-betting aggressively enough, they're not exploiting the fact that you give them automatic profit, and in a sense, you're the one that's exploiting them because you're not paying off their value range after they threw their pre-flop way too tight. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bluff sizing now. Now, what is the goal with our bluff sizing? Well, it's to get the best price on our bluff. Now, sometimes best price can be confusing because we might think it means the cheapest price, and in many cases it does actually, especially low-limit poker. If we find that we're bluffing for, let's say, 2/3 pot, and our opponent's going to fold at exactly the same frequency if we make a half-pot bet, then we're now getting a better price on our bluff. Our opponent's defending range is inelastic, i.e. he folds to the same frequency, but now we're getting a cheaper price on our bluff because we're betting smaller, it's going to be more profitable. And while this might not sound like a very, very big adjustment, we have to keep in mind that poker is a very long-term game. And if you can make a very small adjustment in your strategy, by the time you've played 100,000 or 1,000,000 hands, that's going to translate into a large amount of profits because that situation is repeated over and over. It may not seem like a large amount of profit at the time, but these things add up. Poker is a game of very, very small edges, and if you can fine-tune your strategy in such a way where you're just tweaking your bluff sizing here and there to always get the best price, then it's going to reflect in your long-term winnings. Now, this doesn't mean we should always bluff small. That's maybe another common misconception, because if a big bluff works proportionally more frequently, we can actually refer to that bluff as cheaper. So cheaper doesn't necessarily mean less money, it means we get a better risk to reward ratio. We might find in some cases, for example, that if we bet 2/3 pot, our opponent is going to be folding somewhat often, but if we overbet, maybe he now folds close to 100% of his range. And that's very often going to be very, very profitable for us. So although we invest more chips on that bluff, because it works so much more often, it generates a higher expectation in the long run. So what we're going to do now is we're going to experiment with bet sizing. And this is something you can do yourself if you have Card Runners EV. You can load that very, very simple break-even bluff. So we're betting half pot here, our opponent's defending exactly 67%, our expectation is going to be 0. But let's say that we find, for example, that our opponent is still going to fold at exactly the same frequency if we make a smaller sizing. So let's say we figure out that actually if we bet 18 big blinds, he's going to continue to fold at exactly the same frequency, and when he does call, we're now only going to lose 18 big blinds instead of 25 big blinds. Let's have a look what happens to our expectation. Well, now it's actually gone up, so a small tweak in our bet sizing means that rather than breaking even on every river, we're now making 4 big blinds. That's significant if you see this river 50,000 times, for example, over the course of your poker career. It's going to add up. It's going to translate into winnings. For example, let's say we bet 1 big blind. Now, obviously, the catch here is, although our EV is going to skyrocket now, we can see 16 big blinds expectation, while our opponent's probably not going to continue to defend the same range against that sizing. Now, another thing to think about, let's go back to the break-even sizing again. So we can see that our expectation here is 0. We gave our opponent a range where he had some things like 9x holdings. In other words, our opponent's capped when you consider his range here. You can see that his strongest hand is ace-9. So he's not super, super strong here. Now, we can see that this bluff, I mean, let's say it's going to be slightly profitable. In fact, let's say we bet 20. Okay, we saw that was going to be profitable. So this is an option. Let's say, for example, that we now decide to bet kind of big. You can see that we have 75 big blinds in our stack here in this case. Let's say we decide to overbet. And just take a note of the EV, by the way, 3.33 big blinds with a 20 big blind bluff in this case. Let's say as a result, our opponent just feels now that he has to just fold everything. He doesn't want to defend a 9x for a 1.5x overbet. Let's have a look what happens to our expectation now. You can see our expectation that absolutely skyrockets in this case. So although we're risking more, because the bluff is working at 100% frequency, it's insanely more profitable than a 20 big blind bet. So you can see an example. Firstly, we've seen how reducing the sizing, if it doesn't change its folding frequency, can increase our expectation. We've also seen that it's not the case that larger bets won't generate the highest expectation. It depends how much our opponent is defending. Let's say, for example, that he does call with some frequency. So we'll say that against the overbet, he does actually call, and let's say he calls with the top 5% of hands. So he still mostly folds, but he occasionally wants to defend his 9x, for example. Then the rest of the time he's going to fold. So just have a look how that works out. So the way Cardarana's EV has done it is he calls 4.17% at the time. Let's have a look at our expectation. So it's still very, very high actually in this case. So we can experiment now. What if he doesn't really fold that much more often? So before he was folding 33% at the time, let's say that he now defends the top 40% of his equity. Is that still going to be more profitable than the 20 big blind bet we made, where he actually folded close to the break-even threshold? So he's actually going to fold 60% of the time in this case. Let's have a look at our expectation. You can see this is actually now a losing bet. He's not folding enough. So if the large bet works significantly more often, it can end up being more profitable. But if it only works slightly more often, then we're better off sticking with the smaller sizing. So let's just try one more. So let's say that he folds 80% now, which is still pretty high folding frequency. So our expectation is still pretty high in this case. Now we're not necessarily saying that big bets are better or small bets are better. We're saying that it depends. You have to see how the sizing affects your opponent's folding frequency. And it's not worth making the sizing much, much bigger unless you increase the fold equity you get substantially. You might find it's good to make it smaller if the fold equity doesn't change, for example. And conversely, if you find that making it slightly smaller is going to make your opponent fold way less often, then you're not going to be increasing your expectation that way. So the goal here is not to say big sizes are good or small sizes are good. The goal here is to understand the variables at work here, which is our sizing and how it affects our opponent's folding frequency, and as a result, which sizing is going to generate the highest expectation. Now, in part, this understanding is going to be a function of what opponent has in his range. In this case, we saw that maybe his range was capped. That might lead us towards the larger sizing. But it's not always going to be that simple. In some cases, opponents can have some strong holdings in his range, which we're never going to fold out regardless of how big we bet. So we usually have to make a decision. For example, the type of decision we might make in this scenario is, shall we bet big and try and fold out as much of his range as possible? Or would it be okay for us to say, okay, I'm not going to try and fold out his 9x hands, or better in this case, I just want to fold out his busted draws. And, let's say, for example, that he's not really going to call with ace high even if we bet, let's say, 5 big blinds to the 50 big blind pot here. So what we can do is, we can say, for example, and this is maybe how you can use Cardarana's EV to make estimates here, is, let's say he calls with top pair. So he calls with top pair. It means he's going to be folding if he has a busted draw. Let's just do the EV run there, just so we can see the frequencies. So he's going to be calling. If he has top pair, we're going to have to edit that slightly. What we'll do is we'll put at least top pair. Let's just try that one, see how that looks. So that's slightly better now. You can see that he is folding all of his busted club draws, and he's never folding a 9x. Well, how big do we need to bet into a 50 big blind river for him to fold those hands? I mean, literally, maybe he doesn't want to defend them for a 10 big blind bet, for example. So we can have a look at the expectation of this sizing. So we're generating 12.5 big blinds in EV in this case. Then you'd maybe compare that to betting a much larger sizing. I mean, let's say, for example, we now bet 75, but he's got some strong holdings in his range, which he's never going to fold, or let's say he might be a bit sticky with his top pair some of the time. So he's going to be folding more often, of course, in this case. He's going to, let's say he defends the top 15% of equity. Or let's say the top 25, okay? Just so it's a bit closer. So we saw our expectation was 12.5 big blinds with a very, very small bet. We now have to compare our expectation to the scenario where he's actually folding a lot more when we bet bigger, but is our EV higher? Well, in this case, it's actually slightly better, but maybe in a slightly different scenario, maybe our opponent is not folding proportionally that much more often. So I've just input the situation where our opponent's now only folding 50%. You can see his EV's dropped to 12.5, so it's actually a big losing play. It's not actually as close as it could have been. Let's say, for example, he's now defending the top 35%, so he's folding 65%. Now, is that still going to be higher expectation than our 1/5 pot bet that we were considering? Well, now this is 8.33, so you can see it's not quite as high. It's still profitable, but it's a mistake in the sense that, okay, if we overbet, we generate 8.3 big blinds here, but if we bet 10 big blinds into 50, assuming our assumptions are accurate, we actually generate a higher expectation. So this is potentially going to be a mistake, for example, if we had a choice between this and the other option. So hopefully we get a feel for the variables involved with bet sizing. You can see how changing our sizing can affect our expectation. We have to keep in mind as well that with most players, their calling range won't necessarily be elastic. The idea here is that we have to make decisions regarding our opponent's range and what we're trying to fold out. Now, the goal of a good bluff is not necessarily to fold out everything in our opponent's range. We might, for example, just target his busted draws and use a small sizing, or we might just target second pair holdings and not try and fold out the strong hands in his range. Or in a situation where we think our opponent's capped, maybe we'll maximize our expectation by going for it and trying to fold everything out. I think the important thing here is make a decision when you get to the stage you want to bluff, and we're mainly talking about river situations just because they're the easiest to model as pure bluffs. Semi-bluffs really are going to occur on the earlier streets because it's quite hard for a pure bluff to exist on the flop or turn. So that's why we're mainly talking about river. But when you get to the river, think about what you're trying to fold out. You don't necessarily have to try and fold out your opponent's entire range. It might be fine to just try and fold out second pair, for example, and expect him to always just snap call if he has top pair or better. Okay, so before we summarize, we're going to have a look at a few hand history examples. So in this hand we have Jack 9, we min raise the button, and big blind decides to defend against that min raise. We flop a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. Now this is going to become relevant when we talk about semi-bluffing, but notice we don't have garbage here, we have some potential. Any 10 gives us the nuts, and we also have the backdoor diamonds, and sometimes a Jack on 9 might be good. So this is basically a semi-bluff. And the same applies on the turn. We still have a gut shot in this case. Okay, we don't have a backdoor diamonds anymore. The king doesn't really help us that much. It's not a great card for us, although maybe our opponent might feel pressured to fold his weaker pairs on this card. We don't know. But it's still not a pure bluff. It's a semi-bluff. We have the nut gut shot. So the only point in this hand where we have the option to make a pure bluff is on the river. It's very, very unlikely we have the best hand right now. Even if our opponent did have something like 7-9 or 6-7 or 7-4 somehow, well, he's binked a pair on the river. So it's very, very hard for us to win at showdown right now. That also means that we don't need to worry too much about the expectation of checking. It's probably going to be 0. So it means if we can generate any positive expectation with a river bluff, then it's going to be higher than the expectation of checking, because checking is roughly 0. Whereas let's say we got to this river situation, we binked a 7 on the river, now we have a little bit of a dilemma. We might make automatic profit with a bluff, but we still have to make sure that bluffing has a higher expectation than checking, because we beat some of our opponent's busted draws if we river a 7x, for example, and it's less likely that we should be bluffing this river with a pair of 7s. Jack 9 is pretty straightforward though. We have no showdown value. Our expectation with a check is going to be 0. And so long as we can get our opponent to fold above the required success frequency, then it's going to be profitable for us. And we assume that's the case here, although, especially low limit games, you're going to find that your river bluffs probably work somewhere around the break-even threshold, which means you're not really making a lot of money, you're not really losing a lot of money either. You are losing money for the overall hand, of course, as we mentioned, because, we've invested money into this pot, into this 24.50 pot, and we're basically making a break-even bluff on the river. So let's say our expectation is 0, or let's say it's slightly positive. Let's say we make a couple of big blinds here, because our opponent's slightly overfolding. Even if we make 2 big blinds with this river bluff, we still lose money for the overall hand, because, what's 2 big blinds compared to the 12 big blinds we've already invested into the pot? So it's possible to actually make money on the river while still losing money for the overall hand. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But that's not our problem. Our problem is how do we maximize our expectation on the current street? And if we can generate 2 big blinds with a 17 big blind river bet, then we should absolutely go ahead and do that. It's going to be better than checking, which we've described as pretty much 0 EV, or that's where we estimate it to be. So in this hand we have Queen Jack. We decide to fire a continuation bet 3-way. And once again, we don't have 0 equity here. I mean, it's not a great hand, but the things to keep in mind are we have 2 overcards and we have backdoor straight combinations here. So this is not garbage at all. We have a number of turn cards we can barrel. Decide to fire a continuation bet on the flop. And we pretty much bink the nut barrel card. We now have the OSD. That's exactly what we wanted. Once again, this is not really a bluff in the turn. It's a semi-bluff, which is of course a type of bluff, but we're not discussing those right now. We're discussing pure bluffs with 0 equity. This does not fall into that category, but it's useful to recognize how on earlier streets we probably shouldn't have any 0 equity bluffs unless our opponent has a huge problem with his game. River. Well, do we have showdown value? In some senses we do have showdown value because we beat stuff like 8-9, Jack-9, Jack-8, 6-8. Actually 6-8 gets there. We do beat 1 or 2 things. So our expectation with a check is not going to be 0 here. The guy's going to shot with 8-9 of hearts with some frequency, for example. But our expectation with a check is probably going to be pretty low. So it's not going to be that difficult for bluffing to have a higher expectation in checking, assuming our opponent falls above the automatic profit threshold. So in this case we decided he would do that, and that it's going to be also the same EV as checking. And we decide to bluff in this case. This is also a very good run out to actually bluff with busted straight draws, and the reason for that is a lot of our turn semi-bluffing range is going to be 2 spades, and those will get there on the river. So it's quite easy to have a slightly value-heavy range on these backdoor flush runouts, so we should very, very frequently use our busted straight combos to actually bluff in this case, which is what we do. Once again, if it's a low-limit game, the expectation is not going to be very high. It's not going to make a big difference whether you bluff or whether you check. But we get called in this case because the guy's got top 2, but once again, when we start thinking now about what our bet was designed for, it wasn't designed to fold out King 10. It was designed to fold out stuff like 10x, maybe some King X combos from time to time, but it certainly wasn't anticipated that we'd fold King 10. So it's not a big deal when we get called by this hand. We shouldn't think, oh wow, that's terrible, I shouldn't have bluffed. We should think, okay, he has King 10, I don't expect him to fold King 10 anyway. Sometimes players use this kind of reasoning to avoid good bluff spots, for example. Like they'll get to the situation and they'll say, oh, but my opponent could have a flush, so I'm not going to bluff. Well, of course he could have a flush, but it doesn't matter if he has a flush. If he has a flush, he's calling anyway. We're not curious about whether he has a flush. It doesn't affect the profitability of the decision too much unless he somehow has a flush with a very high frequency. And that's kind of what we're interested in, not whether he can have a flush. That's good for him if he has a flush. It depends on how often he folds, basically. So long as he folds above the break-even success point, it doesn't matter when he has a flush. He's going to call, of course he is. It doesn't mean we made a mistake when he shows a flush. We're interested in what frequency does he not have a flush, for example. Okay, final example, and you probably notice all of these are going to be triple barrel bluffs, and obviously there's more situations than just triple barreling, but it's a good starting point for understanding river bluffs. So 9-4 of hearts, we've got some backdoor equity going on here. We see that. We pick up the flush draw, we have a gut shot. In fact, we have double gutter actually, because any 5 makes us a straight, and any 8 makes us a straight as well. So we definitely want to fire again here. It's not a pure bluff, it's a good semi-bluff. We reach the river and we have 9 high. It's very hard for us to beat anything. We actually lose to 8-9 right now, as far as I'm aware. So our expectation with the check is going to be 0. Whereas, let's say we got to the river and we somehow have a pair. Then we should probably be checking, because although bluffing might make profit, it's very unlikely that bluffing is going to have a higher expectation than a check, assuming we've got some kind of showdown value. Our opponent will have some busted draws. In this case, we don't beat anything, so we bluff. And once again, we get called in this case, and our opponent has queens. which ideally we would have folded out queens, I think. And some cases, there's two ways you can look at this. And the first one is, okay, he had a hand in his range that he's not folding. But if that hand just so happens to be one of the ones you intended to fold out, then maybe there's a problem with your strategy. Maybe the guy is a calling station. You don't always know this when you pull a trigger, but you're going to find out, basically, by playing some hands against the guy. And sometimes you'll have to adjust your strategy. So something might be a theoretically correct bluff, but, queens, okay, I don't think that's like a terrible cooldown. I mean, it's definitely going to be a losing cooldown at low limit games. There's no question about it. But if your opponent calls you with pocket twos here, for example, then you probably shouldn't be bluffing this guy. You'll probably find that bluffing on the river against such an opponent is going to succeed less than the break-even threshold. So you're actually going to be losing money with a river bluff. It's better to just check, even though you know that's 0 EV, because that 0 EV is just going to happen to be max EV, given that bluffing is going to result in a negative EV decision with respect to the current node. Alright, so time to summarize everything. This is what you should know after watching this video. You should understand what a bluff is and the basic formula for generating automatic profit. So in other words, we have to understand how often our bluffs need to work to be profitable. And they're not going to necessarily need to work as often as we think they will have to, because we're often going to have some pot equity. But that's what we're going to discuss in the later episode, which deals with semi-bluffing. So we're just looking at pure bluffs today. So you want to understand the math behind pure bluffs. You want to understand some of the misconceptions regarding bluffing. Stuff like a break-even bluff is not really break-even. Just because a bluff is plus EV doesn't mean it's max EV. We've seen several examples of that today. So in some cases, just because you can profitably bluff doesn't mean that's what you should be doing. Maybe it's better to check. It's going to be higher EV. We've experimented with some bet sizing, and if you do have card runners EV, then you can experiment with the expectation of bluffs of varying sizings with varying amounts of fold equity using the model example that I've demonstrated. And keep in mind, you don't actually need card runners EV to do this. You could actually construct an Excel document with a formula where you input the amount of fold equity you get, the bet sizing you use, size of the pot, for example, and from that generate the expectation of bluffs. So experiment with those. And once again, this kind of experimentation work is going to be best capitalized on when thinking about the type of range that the opponent has. So if you can also put your opponent on a range, you're going to inherently have a better idea of which kind of sizing is going to generate the highest expectation. Okay, so in the next part of this series, we're going to be talking about semi-bluffing. So thanks very much for watching part 3 of this series. Hope to catch you guys in part 4. Thanks for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.